think antiheroes are finished. The luster of antiheroes has worn off. The novelty, the alluring complexity, the bright and shiny new trope at school. What was once a challenge to how we understand morality is now little more than an easy way to create a character that the audience will immediately like and sympathize with. So, do I mean the end of antiheroes in the sense that no one wants to write them anymore and no one wants to read or watch them anymore? No. I mean that the original antihero archetype is dead, the character who held up a visor to the hero ideal that blinded society, allowing us to see the downside to perfection. The character who fluctuated between good and bad morality in an effort to explore humanity and morality on a deeper and more relatable level. I don't think this is why people write antiheroes anymore, nor is the antihero needed to explore complex morality and realism in the modern era. Archetypes might be everlasting, but their necessity can fade. The antihero rose in popularity, and it has remained popular long enough to no longer be needed to facilitate what the original antihero archetype was meant to represent and explore. It hasn't lost popularity. In fact, I don't think it has ever been more popular than it is right now. But that's not really a good thing, because as I've discussed at length on this channel, when you have too much of something, it tends to lose its meaning. I believe there are three distinct eras of the antihero: classic, modern, and postmodern. Each era has a distinct role. Let's start with the classic. Before we cross the line into this video, please remember this is just my opinion. I welcome respectful disagreement in the comments. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoy. All of the spoiler warnings will be on screen now. But I'll try to carry all the little darkness on my back. The antihero archetype has been around for a while, but it's never been as popular as it is now in its new modern form. The classic antihero is still kicking around. Sherlock Holmes just got another iteration, played by Hardin Scott. The titular character of Frieren Beyond Journey's End is a modern example of a classic antihero, but what even is the original idea of the antihero? Well, the term is actually debated. The antihero has become far broader a term in recent years. There are different kinds of antiheroes, with many writers and scholars having their own definitions, subtypes, and parameters. But wading through everyone's opinions, I think there are two general categories that I have come across. The antihero that is the protagonist, but not a hero in the literal sense. So basically a protagonist that is a villain or villain-esque, like Patrick Bateman or Humbert from Lolita, everybody's favorite. This is why we should never have mixed up the terms protagonist and hero, people. The other kind is the antihero that is heroic, but unheroic in action and character. So a character that does bad things and or lacks hero qualities, but is still kind of a hero. Think Walter White before his villain era, Batman, Edward Cullen. Now this video is going to mostly focus on the latter definition, but I do think a lot of what I say can be applied to the former definition as well. Really, I've noticed that it's most often used as a descriptor of a character's morality, which is kind of a vague descriptor if you ask me, but that is only part of the archetype. In the classical sense, though there are different subtypes of antihero, the core traits are pretty consistent. Britannica defines the antihero as a protagonist of a drama or narrative who is notably lacking in heroic qualities. TV Tropes defines the antihero as a character who lacks a handful of the traditional attributes of a hero but is ultimately heroic. This is the classic antihero. Classically, the antihero is a foil to the hero archetype. A foil is a character whose differences are used to highlight certain qualities in the protagonist.
Because you're a man of science. Yeah. Me? Well, I'm a man of faith.
So an antihero being the foil to the hero means that core traits to the hero were opposite in the antihero. This article from Backstage states, a traditional hero is admired or idealized for their courage, nobility, or moral actions. Attaching the anti prefix suggests the opposite of those traditional qualities, but the antihero is more in the middle. Let's look at Sherlock Holmes, a very classic antihero, and compare him to the traditional hero. Heroes were often popular amongst their people, but Sherlock Holmes had few friends and liked it that way. I mean, same. Heroes respected the ideal law and moral code, but Sherlock Holmes would obstruct justice and break laws when necessary, as well as indulge in hard drugs when bored. But I mean, who doesn't? Sherlock Holmes follows his own moral code.
I'm not a hero. I'm a high-functioning sociopath.
The hero is called to serve the greater good. But Sherlock Holmes, while not discounting the greater good, is largely motivated by his own pursuit of stimulation and external attention and validation. And while Sherlock Holmes isn't an example of this specific trait, the antihero is typically not the chosen one. The hero is called, but the antihero chooses. Even if the story didn't have a hero in it, the antihero was still the foil to the traditional hero, offering critique on the archetype even in the absence of it. Because that is what the antihero is at its core, a critique on the hero archetype. That's why it's called the antihero. Writer John Swanbeck said when discussing the different kinds of heroes, superheroes and heroines are on a mission to save the world. Antiheroes and heroines are on a mission to save themselves. Now that isn't to say the antihero won't save the world, particularly if it means ensuring their own survival, which, saving the world typically involves. But saving the world isn't their primary goal, and if it is, they probably won't go about it in a traditionally heroic way. Sherlock Holmes saves the day on numerous occasions, but that isn't necessarily his motivation, rather a happy side effect. In my opinion, the antihero as the foil to the hero character is the most important aspect of being an antihero. The character can still do good things, can still save the day, but as long as they are flawed in comparison to the hero, but obviously not so flawed as the villain, then I believe that character is an antihero. The classic antihero was a critic of pretty much everything, so really fun at parties. The antihero critiqued the hero archetype, societal norms, moral norms, and the reality of what it is to be in a society and moral within that society. If the hero upheld and even transformed the norm, and the villain tried to dismantle the norm, the antihero challenged it, pointed a finger at what isn't said, then slipped back into the shadows with a smile on his face as the stirred pot made a mess on the floor. The antihero doesn't go as far as the villain to upheave society, nor does it maintain or transform it for the better like the hero. The antihero is the outcast that society thinks is wrong and is simultaneously used to highlight what is wrong with society. Plus, the antihero doesn't really care about society. He's not like other heroes. Likewise, the antihero highlights the complexity of morality. They are a means to an end sort of character. If saving the world requires them to get blood on their hands, they will do so, and maybe even relish in the opportunity. Classically, the antihero has been the way to explore morality in a more complex way, perhaps storytellers' first true experiment with the morally gray character. Many scholars agree that the antihero is the hero from one point of view and the villain from another. It is a character who morally fluctuates depending on who is viewing them, another character, and perhaps even the audience. When Sherlock Holmes kills Magnuson, one of the major villains of BBC's Sherlock, narratively it is seen as the only choice, but one that has consequences. Some characters think he went too far, but other characters and the audience are likely to think he was in the right. Of course, the antihero's antics require at least a little disbelief to be suspended. Still, the antihero's messy morality can be seen in real life too. One of the best examples I can think of are the numerous cases of people who kill S-offenders and PDF files. You know what I mean. Yes, it is wrong in the eyes of the law and according to the moral, don't kill people, but many call these people not killers, but vigilantes and heroes. Despite the antihero being a hero to some and a villain to others, the antihero is related far more closely to the hero than to the villain, due to it being the hero's foil. The antihero challenges good morality. It challenges the ideal. They are not evil, they are not even necessarily bad people. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the antihero usually has good intentions, just unfortunate means. The original antihero didn't have to kill liberally and break a bunch of laws to be considered morally ambiguous or gray. They were ambiguous and gray by virtue of being imperfect. I do think it's really important to note that while not every antihero plays the narrative role of the hero in their narrative, some of them do. I'd be willing to bet most of them do. The antihero does bad things for the greater good. They might not deserve to be called a hero, but they are. I don't believe it was the role of the classic antihero to be a realistic character. The antihero might be closer to the everyman than the hero, but the antihero is still not the everyman. The antihero is still a hero and a figure of great importance, just without all the accolades and pedigree of a hero. The antihero might challenge the morals of society, but within their narrative, they are still the one trying to save the day, even if they go about it in an unheroic way, and even if they fail. The classic antihero is about being a hero despite not being hero quality. Their moral ambiguity and grayness existed to be comparison to moral uprightness, not necessarily out of a desire to make a character feel real. I think that may have just been another happy side effect. We no longer live in a world that worships heroes. The antihero no longer needs to critique them. The classic antihero's purpose was to critique and challenge society, morality, and heroism. But the archetype has evolved, or perhaps branched off, into a new antihero and a new purpose. One a little less glorious.
Till things are brighter, I'm the man in black. Shades of gray wherever I go.
Where the classic antihero ends and the modern antihero begins is when the archetype's function changed from critiquing society, morals, and heroes to exploring more complex characters. This article from Backstage talks about the purpose of antiheroes in stories, pointing out that characters who wrestle with questions of morality have a quality every successful storyteller should consider: relatability. Antiheroes make compromises or can't afford the luxury of idealism. Audiences relate most to characters who are forced to make questionable choices. That is the main purpose of the modern antihero. But why did the role change? Well, first we should consider if this is a change in role. Was the classic antihero not relatable? Did they not make questionable choices? Well, yes. The classic antihero is inherently more relatable than the hero archetype. Perhaps it wasn't the purpose of the classic antihero, but it was definitely a side effect of the archetype simply being imperfect. People couldn't relate to the hero, didn't want to relate to the villain, so the antihero was one of the archetypes that filled the shoes of relatability. However, a character making questionable choices is not the epitome of modern relatability. Realism is. Which brings me to what I like to call realistic character evolution. I know I'm like a scholar from Oxford. Writers have slowly, heavily leaned into focusing on realistic characters. This includes flaws, mistakes, questionable choices, and an overall lack of human idealism. Creating a character that feels like a real person is the main goal of modern character creation. The more realistic, the better the character. Of course, not every writer has this goal, but the majority do. Characters are no longer primarily representations of an idea anymore, but the imitation of an actual person. They are no longer just there to move the plot forward, but are now often the focus of the story itself. Classic antiheroes were close to being realistic. They certainly were more realistic than the classic hero, but it wasn't the archetype's purpose. They were supposed to be relatable, but they weren't meant to mimic a real person. It is the purpose of the modern antihero to be realistic. They are a direct result of realistic character evolution. The popularity of the modern antihero is, in my opinion, directly tied to the characterization goal of realism. But are they actually more realistic? Well, yes and no. Compared to the hero and villain, yes, but compared to the average person, well, do you think Thomas Shelby is a good example of the average Joe? In the search for complexity, the modern antihero leaned into another very popular trait: gray morality. The much talked about morally gray character. This character does not neatly fall into right or wrong. Imagine morality as a 0 to 100 spectrum, with 0 being Satan and 100 being Jesus. Or if you don't want to bring religion into it, 0 being Dio and 100 being Joseph Joestar. Gray morality is essentially the 1 to 99 range, with the bottom and top 15% being what we'd consider to be the worst and best of society. The morally gray character can be good and bad, neither, can fluctuate depending on the circumstance. It is a broad character type that encompasses most modern characters. But is the morally gray character realistic? I have an entire video on this, my first video actually, so my thoughts have evolved a little bit, but I do believe the morally gray character is the most realistic character type. But it's not inherently realistic. We see these morally gray characters who linger in the lower end of the morality spectrum and call them realistic simply because they are flawed and make questionable choices, which is also the reason why the classic antihero was seen as relatable. But just because a character has flaws and makes questionable choices doesn't mean they're realistic. Realism considers the entire character, prioritizing consistent, cohesive, and realistic characterization over making the character as unpredictable and dangerous as possible. In fact, because so many morally gray characters are exactly that, unpredictable and dangerous, they have become predictably unpredictable. But that's besides the point. While the classic antihero, the Aragorn, is less relatable to the average person than the classic antihero may have been, the morally gray antihero only has perceived relatability due to the archetype being inherently flawed. Especially in fantasy, the morally gray character is not defined by mistakes and flaws, but by how many crimes the character is willing to commit, how many times they are willing to betray their allies, and how sympathetic they are to the audience. The morally gray character has become a competition to see how traumatized and dangerous a character can be, not how realistic and relatable they are. The morally gray character is an inevitable phase of the realistic character evolution, and perhaps even the final form of it. I mean, it makes sense. People are inherently morally gray. I think it's okay to wish death upon everyone in a Costco because, let's be real, that entire store is just one hellish fusion experiment, and you think it's okay to drive a little too close to cyclists. As we get further into realistic character writing, the further we get from the hero and villain archetypes, the grayer things become. The classic antihero was definitely an important phase in this evolution, but the modern antihero has been consumed by it. The modern antihero and the morally gray character are basically interchangeable. Antiheroes have essentially assimilated to the morally gray realistic evolution phase. Antiheroes have always been morally gray, and the purpose of challenging societal and moral norms are still present in some characters, but it's not specific to the antihero anymore. The modern antihero is the unheroic hero the classic antihero used to be, but watered down in purpose and execution, becoming lost in the morally gray spectrum. To a degree, I think this conflation was inevitable. People often use antihero and morally gray interchangeably, antiheroes are inherently morally gray, and many morally gray characters end up being antiheroes, especially if they're a main character. They serve the same function now, to create complex, realistic characters. The conflation of antiheroes and morally gray characters was a mistake. Antiheroes in the classic sense are foils of the hero, but they are not straight-up villains. They critique society, morality, heroism, but they don't demolish the ideal. In a way, they amplify the best parts of the hero and the worst parts of the villain. But due to antiheroes becoming interchangeable with morally gray characters, we have characters who don't deserve to be called antiheroes being called antiheroes. Song-woo from Squid Game shouldn't be called an antihero. He used everybody to save himself, and while survival is a goal of the antihero, there is nothing about his character or arc that is remotely heroic. He is simply a morally gray character. The antihero, in the classic sense at least, isn't really supposed to dip into the bottom 15% of the morality spectrum. They aren't supposed to be a straight-up villain. Walter White started as an antihero, a classic one at that, but he became a villain as the series progressed. If the classic antihero is the villain to some and the hero to others, then they can't be in the bottom 15%, or they would never be considered the hero except by other bottom 15%ers. We don't call Hitler a hero just because the Nazis did. We've gone too far in defining the antihero by their morality, or lack thereof. They were meant to challenge the reader and the society within the book's idea of morality, but now they are deprived of morality. A villain in some people's eyes doesn't mean a villain to everyone who has a concept of the law's eyes. The classic antihero transformed into the modern antihero, which watered itself down until it was lost in the sea of the morally gray character, which encompasses most of modern characters. The original purpose of the antihero is being filled by characters who cannot call themselves antiheroes. The modern antihero has a purpose, an inglorious purpose, to create complex, realistic, and often deplorable characters. And in this purpose, the archetype essentially became redundant to the morally gray character, effectively jumping off a cliff into rocky waters. The morally gray character is extremely efficient at establishing a connection with the audience, out of pure entertainment value, if not genuine empathy and relatability. This article from Backstage points out, there are times when the antihero appeals to the audience and is a likable gray character. Even if the morally gray character does deplorable things, as long as they're sympathetic, the audience will generally still be on their side. To get on my soapbox for a quick moment here, that's kinda bad. We don't decide heroes and villains by their humanity, but by their actions. Okay, I just gotta get off my soapbox now. The morally gray character, and even the classic antihero, is more accessible to the audience than the hero or villain archetypes. The classic antihero introduced a heroic character with flaws. The archetype was usually less flawed than villains, but more so than heroes. So the archetype offered relatability regarding how imperfect humans are, but still generally better than the worst of us. You know, to keep the audience comfortable. But this flaw-focused relatability is not exclusive to the antihero anymore. Neither is challenging society, morality, and heroism. Because the morally gray spectrum is so broad, and as a result of the realistic character evolution, any character, no matter their narrative role, is flawed, can challenge society, morality, heroism, and villainy. The hero isn't perfect anymore, and the villain isn't pure evil, and the antihero is no longer the in-between because there's no true gap anymore. Take the hero. A person can be driven by the need to do good and still be flawed and realistic and even make detrimental mistakes. I think the MCU actually does have a couple succinct examples in Thor and Star-Lord in Avengers Infinity War. During the final battle with Thanos, both Star-Lord and Thor let their emotions control them, and they end up making detrimental mistakes that lead to Thanos snapping his fingers and erasing half the population.
You should have gone for the head.
These are heroes who do make huge mistakes, but they are still heroes. They are still morally good. Being upright doesn't mean you have no flaws. Boromir tries to take the ring, but he's still a moral hero. The hero used to be a paragon, the symbol of human and sometimes even divine perfection to aspire to be, but they aren't anymore. We don't look at the 9 worthies as ideals of chivalry anymore. We look at them and know that King David had an affair and Alexander the Great had daddy issues. Characters are more realistic now, and that doesn't mean every character is an antihero in the classic sense, but it does mean pretty much every character now is morally gray. Being good and being flawed are not mutually exclusive. The same can be said for the villain. In general, people have a more liberal view towards entertainment than they used to. We understand that liking and even siding with the Joker from The Dark Knight doesn't mean we want to watch the world burn. This nullifies the need for the antihero to be the audience's conduit for vicarious villainy. We can like the villain, empathize with them, and even side with them without feeling morally dubious because we understand it's just fiction. It's just fantasy. It's just a story, bro. And it's not only the fact that we've mostly let go of the whole liking Mr. Blonde means you want to burn a cop alive belief. It's also the fact that villains aren't made like they used to be. You don't really get a Sauron anymore. You don't get an Emperor Palpatine. You get Thanos. You get Dexter. You get almost every character from A Song of Ice and Fire. You get these villains that are written to be sympathetic, empathetic, and realistic. Modern villains are engineered to be likable and sympathetic just like modern heroes are engineered to be flawed. Dark Lords aren't just allegories for Satan and sin and fascism anymore. They're people. Murderers sometimes help old ladies cross the street. Now, I will admit there is a caveat to the villain side of this point. It doesn't have a ton to do with the video, but I do think I need to mention it. There are certain types of villains that is societally not okay to side with or empathize with. As a side effect of this writing realistic characters that feel like people, it can be morally dubious to like a villain that is born from the darkest parts of human society. It's not problematic to like the characterized Dark Knight's Joker, but it is problematic to like steep in realism 2019 Joker. When guys on Reddit say they have never related to a character more than Patrick Bateman, that's concerning. I read that book. That character deals with severe issues and themes in a very realistic way. The Dark Knight's Joker, or Sauron, or Emperor Palpatine, while representing some awful ideas, are characterized. They're fantastical. Yeah, Palpatine represents a dictator, but he also has lightning powers and looks funny. You can suspend your disbelief more. But with characters like Bateman in 2019 Joker, it's harder to. The antihero is no longer the critic of morality. The morally gray character is no longer beholden to a few archetypes. Morality can be questioned by any character, any archetype, nullifying the antihero further, a result of the realistic character evolution that the antihero arguably started. In search for complexity, the antihero essentially killed itself. Realistic character evolution, which the classic antihero was an original proponent of, ultimately led to the nullification of the archetype. The morally gray character pervading through characterization as a whole was always going to happen as writers leaned into realism. The morally gray character is no longer just the antihero and the secondary antagonists and the fickle sidekicks. The morally gray character is now the hero, the villain, and every archetype in between. It became more popular to write morally gray characters than simply a classic antihero. and it became more popular to write every character as morally gray, watering down the antihero archetype and eventually nullifying it altogether. The modern antihero doesn't really exist anymore. What was once a way to create complex characters became fused with the more popular way to write complex characters. You don't need antiheroes when every character is morally gray. The classic antihero's role has been taken over. When heroes and villains are morally gray, when heroes and villains both challenge the status quo, antiheroes no longer have a defined place in stories. Even characters who resemble the classic antihero, such as Frieren, are lost in the sea of morally gray characters. And let's just say for a second that the modern antihero and the morally gray character haven't been conflated, that's just a me issue. The morally gray character still nullifies the antihero because they have the same role, classically and in modern day. The conflation of the morally gray character and the antihero means that every and any character can be the antihero. Every character can challenge society, morality, heroism, villainy. And when everyone is the antihero, no one is.
There ain't no rainbow shining on me. Shades of gray are the colors I see. It's me. I'm the problem, it's me.
The postmodern antihero is the consequence of conflating the antihero and the morally gray character, the evolution of character development towards the realistic, and simply having so many antiheroes. The postmodern antihero is the morally gray antihero we are so used to seeing in media. The main focus is on the moral actions of the character, those actions not necessarily serving as critique of morality and society anymore, and not even necessarily meant to be critiqued by morality and society, because writers know people love watching the antihero do some bad things. You know it's wrong, but it's fun to watch. They are no longer the hero to some and the villain to others, no longer defined by moral ambiguity. You know what side they're on. Their own, and other characters may be lucky enough to be included in that. It is a washed up archetype that serves only one unique purpose, a purpose that is the side effect of realistic characterization. The postmodern antihero's role is to create instantly likable characters. It's not that the postmodern antihero isn't written with intention beyond making an instantly likable character, but it's the perhaps subconscious realization that morally gray characters are very popular and the utilization of that popularity, whether intentional or not. The modern antihero, or the morally gray character, was meant to create complex characters, realistic characters, as writers head further down the path of realism. The postmodern antihero is often realistic because it is also a consequence of realistic character evolution, but that's not the point. The postmodern antihero utilizes realism, specifically the interesting and empathetic parts, to create characters that the audience can instantly connect with, or at least instantly like. Morally gray characters depend on two things to be liked: personality and trauma. While the morally gray character and even the antihero before it comes in many flavors, I think many people would associate the morally gray character with two distinct personality types, obviously with some nuance allowed. Number 1, mysterious rogue, which offered the immediate illusion of depth because of the nature of being mysterious and brooding. And 2, the charismatic charmer, which offered a personality that was immediately entertaining and engaging. Personality can make the audience immediately like the character. Trauma can make the audience immediately feel for the character. Now, this is going to sound a little Instagram-y, I don't know, but the postmodern antihero is basically weaponized trauma. It is creating a character who has suffered and using that suffering to garner sympathy and empathy from the audience so you will not only like and feel for them, but stick by them when they do horrible things. It's a basic formula, one that I definitely use. The more trauma a character has, the more leeway they often get from the audience. Perhaps we can't excuse awful behavior with trauma in real life, but we can in Fantasyland. Likewise, the more engaging the character's personality, the more on board we are to watch them do horrible things, because once again, it's fun. Beyond these two personality tropes, beyond the trauma, the very fact that these characters are morally gray is enough to lure in the audience. We like gray morality. As I've said, it's more relatable, it's more realistic. Yes, it's entertaining to watch a character make a mistake and burn their life to the ground, but it's also real life. Gray morality is everywhere in fiction now. Idealized heroes are few and far between outside of superheroes and movies for a younger audience, but even those heroes and characters are starting to become more realistic, as seen with K-pop Demon Hunters, and more morally gray, as seen with Thunderbolts. Many of the stories I've talked about on this channel are centered around morally gray characters. People want the gray, people need the gray. Writers who write realistically are touted as some of the best because it shows a depth and understanding that more traditional and shallower characters lack. Gray morality, realism, they're selling features. If there's a story with morally gray characters, people are going to read it, they're going to watch it, and the moral grayness will continue to spread like the virus it is. I'm kidding, I like it. I do. Yeah, it's not a problem. The purpose of creating complex characters is no longer beholden to one archetype or one type of character. As I stated earlier, pretty much every character now is morally gray, so what is left for the antihero to be? A cheat code for creating engaging characters.
It must be exhausting, always rooting for the anti-hero.
Antiheroes were a natural and necessary phase in the evolution of character creation, but their decline in necessity is also a natural progression. As characterization becomes more complex and realistic, heroes are no longer confined to the good box, and villains are no longer confined to the bad box. Progression that essentially nullifies antiheroes, with virtually any character able to take on the roles they have played, making them less vital. Archetypes don't just disappear. They're recurring patterns, which is what makes them archetypes. The classic antihero is still around. I mean, I had enough clips for this video, but now they're just lumped in with the morally gray character. The roles specific to the classic antihero and then the modern antihero aren't specific to them anymore. Antiheroes might not actually be dead, but they're not needed. Their function has been taken over by the morally gray character. And as gray morality continues to spread throughout every archetype, heroes can criticize heroes. But what if gray morality isn't spreading, and the antihero is just becoming a broader archetype? Well, if one of the core traits of the antihero is to contrast the hero, to be anti whatever the hero is, and if they can no longer continue to contrast the hero, not because the antihero has changed, but because the hero is no longer the ideal, then there is no anti-hero anymore. An archetype loses meaning when it exists to be a juxtaposition of another archetype, but then the contrasting archetype changes so much that there's no real juxtaposition anymore. Heroism isn't really about paragons anymore. That core function is no longer specific to the antihero. There have always been examples of heroes and villains with more complex morality than just good or bad. Archetypes and tropes are not rules. The boxes are breakable, but that doesn't mean the box is always broken. Archetypes and tropes are treated like rules to follow. The antihero allowed the heroes to remain unsullied and the villains to remain sullied. Good and bad morality could still be upheld, while the antihero was the one getting muddy. But now everyone gets muddy. The classic antihero critiqued society and morality, but every character can do that now. The modern antihero explored complex morality and characters but was swallowed by the morally gray character. The postmodern antihero is a formula to make instantly likable characters, and in consequence is merely reminiscent of the original archetype. While I do think realistic character evolution is a good thing, it does have a downside. The antihero is not the only archetype that could become a casualty of realistic character evolution. If every character is realistic, then what is the point of archetypes? People aren't archetypes, we're more nuanced than that. Yes, in almost every facet, physically and mentally, I am the classic hero, but I'm not perfect. I'm not a paragon. I don't know if it's going to come into fruition anytime soon, but I do think if we continue on the trajectory of realistic characters, then archetypes will become obsolete. We'll enter a post-archetype landscape. But is the death of archetypes even a bad thing? I don't know. Let me know what you think. I do know that I don't think the realistic character evolution is a bad thing, but I do think if every character becomes realistic and we lose what the archetypes represented, well, realism can be quite bleak and potentially boring. Yes, the classic hero isn't the most realistic character, but what's wrong with wanting to aspire to an ideal? What's wrong with wanting to watch a character you could never hope to be go on an adventure and beat the incarnation of evil? Look, I know most of us are Pippin, and maybe not even him, but sometimes it's just cool to imagine ourselves as Aragorn. Archetypes show us who we could be and who we definitely should not be. Morality is gray, but there are limits. People who don't care about being good and about the people around them are called psychopaths, amongst other disorders. Likewise, you should never become the worst person, the person who everyone knows is evil. Without these archetypes, we might lose the ability to recognize the best of us and the worst of us. I think that may have been part of the original purpose of the Antihero. Showing us the dark side of the hero didn't mean we shouldn't have heroes. It just meant they were like the rest of us, and that we can also be heroes. The Antihero called out what was wrong with society and morality and heroism without completely tearing them down, because we do need these things. It was a way to critique and criticize without demolishing. Because if they tore everything down without regarding what it could do to society, well, that's villain behavior, if you ask me.
No more heroes anymore. No more heroes anymore.
I'm done ranting now. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like if you like, and check out some of my other videos because you might like those too. I hope you take my opinion as anything but gospel, but if you do like my opinions, subscribing with the bell will guarantee you more of them. And I, of course, welcome your opinions in the comments, which I always love reading and really appreciate. I hope this video made sense. This was one of my harder scripts to put together. Felt like I was out of my depth at a few points, but I do think I managed to pull it together into something coherent. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're ever not sure what the right thing to do is, remember that the real Dexter went to prison, and you're not the main character.